Hello everyone, welcome back to another deck profile with me, Chocobilly. So, this week I am looking at a deck I have called Zentet-Summon 1.2. So, 1.2 because it's a slight errata to a deck I made previously. But, yeah, as you can probably tell, it focuses a lot on Odin and Summoners. And it's, well, this is me kind of doing me things. So, it's not, definitely not nothing meta. And, it can be a bit clunky, is probably the best way to put it. You have to get things out in the right order, and it has to, it takes a little time for you to be able to set up. So if you come up against aggression, you might be alright because there are a few saving EXs and things like that, but ultimately it requires you to kind of get the setup ready for you to start doing some fun things. But when you can start doing them, they are fun. So I will work through the forwards, summons, and then backups. 19 forwards, 15 summons, and 16 backups. So as you can see, quite a high summon count. So first up we have Iliwa. So Iliwa is a pretty standard lightning card anyway, but she is searchable off of Sid of Clan Gully, which is, you know, nothing new here. But what's important here is the fact that she has her own little protection bubble, but her Sheol, I can't remember now, S, which is activate all the forwards you control, they gain haste until the end of the turn, all the forwards your opponent controls lose 2,000 power. So really being able to activate things and give them haste is very powerful, but when you combine that with the likes of Alice the Ensorcelled, who cannot activate on your activation phase, just be able to have, I don't know, Iliwa already on the field, you play Alice the Ensorcelled, use Sheol to then activate Alice the Ensorcelled, she can now attack as well, and when she attacks, your opponent puts a forward they control into the break zone, so quite powerful. But also combining that with the likes of Man in Black as well, whenever he attacks, you get to choose a summon in your break zone, and remove from the game, and then you can cast it whenever you see fit. So yeah, being able to haste Man in Black as well is really, really nice. Seymour is another fun one. Being able to haste him, so maybe you play him onto the field to break one of your opponent's forwards, use Sheol to give Seymour haste, you can then dull him to remove 6 summons from your break zone to then deal your opponent 1 point of damage. So it might be a case you're just trying to get that final point of damage through. Seymour might be the way to do it. Right, next we have Porum. So when Porum's put the field into the break zone, choose one summon in your break zone, add it to your hand. Pretty standard in a high summon count deck, but it's just really, really useful. There's a lot of putting your summons into the break zone in this deck and lots of summon retrieval in this deck. So using something like Porum just to make sure you get those summons that you really want back in your hand through her. And the likes of those would be something like the 6-cost Odin from Opus 12, a Tomos, maybe Ixion as well. I mean, it's all very situational. It depends on what you're looking for. But ultimately, being able to use Porum to get her back to your hand, to be able to get those summons back to your hand, is really, really strong. And what's more is that she is a category 4 character in water, which means that Kane from Opus 17 can retrieve her as well. Right, next up we have Unileska. So, the cost required to cast your summons is reduced by 1 for each job summoner forward you control. It cannot become 0, and when Unileska enters the field, choose one summon in your break zone, place it at the bottom of your deck. So, yeah, just being able to make your summons cost even less is really, really cool. So we have the Una backup, which will reduce the cost of your water summons by 1 anyway, but then having Unileska on the field means that then any forward summoners will reduce the costs as well. And when it comes to forward summoners, we have Unileska, Seymour, Alice the Ensorcelled, and I think that's it. But even though that's not a huge amount, I mean, to be honest, if you ever get into a position where, oh sorry, and Rydia's one as well. But if you're ever in a position where you've got Unileska and maybe a couple of other summoners on the field already, you're probably doing alright anyway, so that cost reducing for summons is, I mean, you probably already won at that point. But yeah, being able to get the cost reduction on some of these bigger summons is really, really cool. But being able to use it alongside this Odin, whose cost also gets reduced from the Odins you have in your break zone, means that you can start breaking any forward for pretty cheap, to be honest. And what's more is that this works excellently with something like Rydia. Whenever you cast a summon, you get to choose a forward and reduce, or it loses power equal to the CP you pay for that summon. So let's say we're playing this Odin and we have, I don't know, 3 Odins in the break zone, and then you have Rydia and Unileska on the field. You would only pay 1 CP for this Odin. You can break any forward your opponent controls, and then you get to do minus 6k power to a forward as well through Rydia's effect. So getting all of these summons for pretty cheap is really, really cool. It's also worth noting that she can put something back into your break zone as well. So if you do cast something like Rydia or the Ico backup, where you put a summon into your break zone, you can then maybe reuse something like Unileska to just put it back in the deck. So generally, it'll probably be something that either you might want to search, or just another EX just to shove back into your deck. And if you get a chance to shuffle, it might go back on top or near the top at least. Right, next up we have Seymour. So you're going to have lots of summons in your break zone. Chances are when he comes into the field, you'll get to break something. I mean, I've already mentioned pretty much his stick here. He gets to break something and then also deal another point of damage. You're running 15 summons in this deck, so it is quite possible that you could dull Seymour, remove 6 summons from the break zone, deal opponent a point of damage, then use Ilio's S again to reactivate Seymour, dull him again to then remove a further 6 summons from the break zone. So it's possible to do his effect twice in this deck. Don't get me wrong, I have played this deck a fair few times, and the amount of times I played it onto the field and I haven't seen any summons is surprising, given the fact that it is basically a third of the deck. But it does happen sometimes, so you have to be careful of that. Either way, with all the means of getting summons into your break zone, so Rydia and Ico, actually also you have, where is she? Al-Rashia, so Pair Lightning, dull, discard 1 summon to search for a summon out of your hand is another way of funding Seymour's ability as well. Right, Man in Black, one of the core components of this deck. Well, I say core components, one of the funnest components of this deck. So he enters the field or attacks, you get to remove a summon from your break zone, and then you can cast it as if you own it, and then you put it back into the break zone, so it doesn't say removed, which is really, really nice. And then every time you do cast a summon, you choose a forward your opponent controls, it either cannot attack or block, which is, pretty good as well. So again, really utilizing the fact that a lot of these summons can become really, really cheap. If you're casting something like this 6 cost Odin to break something, then make it so forward can't block or attack. Really nice. If you combine Rydia with that as well, you make something can't block, and then you make something lose 6k power, and then you break a forward. That's 3 things with 1 really cheap summon. So yeah, it's just really, really nice to be able to do that, and this is every time Man in Black attacks as well. So it might be a case that you only have 1 or 2 summons in your break zone. So long as Man in Black is allowed to keep on attacking, which to be fair will be quite unlikely, you'll be able to keep on removing these summons and then keep on replaying them and just absolutely nuking your opponent's field. And that, to be honest, this Odin is one of the reasons I built this deck, because actually it's not hard now to get him down to a really reasonable cost, and a lot of these other Odins are pretty good as well. And this Odin, for example, its cost is reduced by 3 when you're at 5 damage, so it becomes 2 cost. If you're running something like Unileska on the field, then it only costs you 1, which is really good to be able to break something for 1. It's a break a forward of 5 or less, to be fair. But yeah, just being able to constantly replay these summons, which you're able to get into your break zone very easily, and a lot of these summons are really powerful as well. Not too shabby in my opinion. Alright, next we have Maki the Phantasm. So he's only a one-off, but ultimately making it so your opponent's forwards enter the field dull is actually quite nice, because it sets your opponent back a turn effectively, in terms of attacking and blocking anyway, but also just another way to be able to get out Alice the Ensorcelled, of which there is only a one of as well. So they're not a core component of the deck, but they are fun little extra bits to have, and they are both FFTA2 characters, which means they are searchable off of Sid of Clan Gully. So it might be a case that you've already seen your Alice, so then you go and search Maki the Phantasm with Sid of Clan Gully, and then the following turn you play Maki to then pay the 2 to get Alice back onto the field. So yeah, lots of fun ways to be able to just recur Alice and have her attack. But like I said before, just making it so that your opponent's forwards enter the field dull means that any of the few forwards they do have standing up maybe can't block because you've got some Man in Black, or you can easily break them using some of your many summons. And yeah, just puts your opponent on the back foot a little bit. And similarly with Alice the Ensorcelled, so she, as I mentioned before, she doesn't activate in your active phase, but if she does ever get to attack, your opponent chooses a forward, or your opponent selects a forward and puts it into the break zone, which is a very strong effect. And there are loads of ways to be able to activate Alice in this deck. So I mentioned before, we've got the Ilio S ability, but then we also have Rosa, which is another standard one. You just pay 0 to activate her, which is really cool, considering you can do it on your opponent's turn and your turn. So you maybe have to use Rosa on your turn to activate something else other than Alice, and then on your opponent's turn you can then activate Alice, so she's still active on your turn. Really powerful. And then you've also got something like Fairy as well to be able to choose on forward activated draw card, which is nice. Now there's only one Fairy, sure, but again with something like Man in Black, which allows you to keep on replaying your summons, it means that hopefully you can keep on reactivating Alice the Ensorcelled and keep on putting things into the break zone. Right, next up we have Kane, who's I actually think is a really fun card. So he has an EX burst when Kane enters the field. Choose one water category 4 character in your break zone, add it to your hand, and then if you don't control a forward other than Kane, Kane gains plus 1,000 power and haste. So the 4 characters he can recur are Porum, Rydia, Rosa, and the Cecil backup, because he can recur characters, which is quite nice, given that Cecil does have a break effect. And then if you don't control any other character or any other forward, then he becomes an 8k with haste, which is also quite nice because he's like an alternative to Ilio. It doesn't have the protection, but is a little bit bigger, and does get you something back to hand, so technically a bit cheaper as well. What's also nice is that you can use his ability as a bit of a combat trick. So maybe you've got 2 forwards, Kane and something else. Your other forward dies when your opponent's attacking with forwards. Your opponent attacks with another forward. Kane's now gone up in power by 1k. However, you can combo that with Quan, which then means you can pay 1 and dull to then use Kane, or to then make Kane plus 2k and haste as well, which means he's now a total of plus 3. So he jumps from being a 7k to a 10k just because he's the only forward on the field, and you will come across opponents just forgetting about this effect, so it's quite nice to have that there. Right, next up we have Rydia, another key part of the deck. So when she enters the field, you search 2 summons, each with a different cost, and then your opponent selects 1 card among them, puts it into the break zone, and the other one to your hand. And then when you cast a summon, choose on forward opponent controls, it loses 1,000 power for each CP required to cast that summon until the end of the turn. A really strong effect, and like I said before, being able to utilize that with some high cost summons, which are actually fairly cheap, is really, really good. So I mean, to be honest, this Odin, there's a case to be made for actually casting this Odin now, because you get to break 2 forwards, which is really, well, I say break 2 forwards. You get to minus 7k one forward and break another, and minus 7k is a decent amount and will probably be able to kill something. Obviously, your opponent may have some means of buffing it out of range, which would be sad, but, you know, then maybe throw Melty Gemini into the deck, I don't know. Either way, Odin to be able to break something and then hopefully minus 7k, but then you've also got the likes of this Odin, as I said before. It can become quite cheap quite easily, so you can minus 6k something, break something else. This Odin can become very, very cheap late game, and again, almost maybe break something, but just being able to use this in combat as well, being able to make it so that maybe you are blocking with Rydia, your opponent is attacking with a 7k, you then cast something like, I don't know, this Odin to break another of your opponent's forwards, and then the attacking forward loses 3k. Not too shabby at all. Being able to put things into the break zone, I've mentioned that a few times now. Now, obviously, it depends. You have to do it on a case-by-case basis, and with Rydia's effect, you have to try and make... I mean, there'll be 2 summons which are fairly obvious which one you want to go into the break zone when you play it, but still, you don't want to make it so that you always end up with the bad summon. So make sure to pick 2 decent ones. And most of the time, I was always picking either just 2 Odins, and it will always be this Odin and this Odin, probably. No, it won't always be those 2, but being able to leave your EXs in the deck is quite nice, but if you do take them out, you have a means of using less to put it back in. But I think if you take this Odin, if you say you took these 2 Odins, your opponent is faced with the fact that you get to break a forward of 4 or less, and people play a lot of 5 cost or more forwards, don't get me wrong, but most of the heavily played cards these days are cheaper, so they are forced to either give you this Odin, and you can definitely break something for cheap if you're running something like Unesco, even cheaper, and then only minus 4k something, versus you having to invest a lot but paying 7 to break effectively 2 forwards. And ultimately you get to put an Odin into the break zone, which then will lower the cost of this Odin. Or it might just be a case that you are going to be funding Man in Black, so you can play Rydia onto the field and you get to, I don't know, let's say you take this Odin and this Odin. Your opponent will probably choose for you to keep this one, so this one goes into the break zone, so you don't get to cast it for cheap, at which point you can then cast Man in Black by discarding the 7 cost Odin, which then recurs this one to remove from game, so then you can cast it for cheap anyway. So it kind of switches the 2 out, but you also gain a big forward that can then recast the summon anyway. So there's a couple of weird ways of funding these things. Just be mindful that you can rinse yourself of all your summons as well. And then finally Rosa. So pay 0, choose one of the 2 following actions. If you control a card named Cecil, choose 2. So either choose 1 forward, activate it, choose 1 forward against plus 1,000 power till the end of the turn. I have the Cecil backup, which counts. So that means that if you have this Cecil on the field with Rosa, you get to choose both, and it's pay 0 to do both abilities, which is really, really good. Be able to activate something and give something plus 1,000 power is really strong. As I mentioned before, just being able to activate where is she? Alice in Sorcel is really nice, but then being able to activate maybe Kane when he goes up in power. So it might be a case you've got Rosa and Kane. You use Rosa's ability to buff Kane and activate him. You then block with Rosa. Rosa dies. Kane then goes up in power to then become a 9k because he'll have been +1, and then his own ability is +1. So you know, a nice little power swing. Obviously, you could still do that with Rosa, but it's combat tricks. It's fun. Again, be able to reactivate Seymour as well, so dull, or it might just be you attack with him, you then activate him, then use the ability to deal a point of damage. You know, there's loads of different ways to be able to use his abilities. Activating Porum so she can block and get you a summon back to hand, really, really nice. There's all these different means of being able to activate forwards, which actually have really good abilities to then do combat tricks with. Right, oop, trying to bump up my microphone. Next, we'll move on to the summons. So, 4-cost Odin. Only a couple of these. There could be a case to be made to play the 3-cost Odin, which I think is like Opus 10, 11, something like that, which breaks a monster of 3 or a forward of 3, just to be able to get that monster coverage as well, because at the moment in this deck there isn't really any means of breaking any monsters. But this Odin is relatively cheap, and like I said before, a lot of the forwards that can play these days are smaller anyway, so running this Odin I think has more worth now. 7-cost Odin, just a nice EX burst to be able to break anything, and ultimately if you do have to cast it, if you've got something like Rydia on the field, it means that hopefully you're killing 2 things. Bismarck. So, choose 1 monster, return to its owner's hand. That's fine, but not great. Choose 1 character you control, return to its owner's hand. Very nice to be able to just protect your own stuff. So your opponent will probably try to get rid of Man in Black, or Rosa, Rydia, some of these really problematic forwards. They might invest a decent amount into it. Just pay the 1 for Bismarck because you have the unit backup, get it back to hand, and then you can replay it as well. And even though there's only 1 Bismarck, Man in Black means that you can keep on replaying it, hopefully. And then ultimately, choose 1 forward, half its power until the end of the turn. That combined with Rydia's effect is quite nice. So being able to, let's say, cast 6-cost Odin for 3, you get to minus 6k something, and then you get to break another forward. Then you can cast Bismarck, minus 2k something else, and let's say half the power of the forward that has a minus 6k, chances are it is now dead. Right, then we've got Fairy, mentioned before, just being able to activate things, much the same as what I said with Rosa, but just having that in your hand. If your Rosa's on the field, your opponent can see what you're going to be activating, and they can preempt that. Having Fairy in hand, or removed from the game with Man in Black, at least means that you have that kind of in the pocket, and you can respond with that as well. Odin, I mean, like I said before, the reason I built the deck, to be honest. It's just being able to reduce his cost by 1 for each summon. Even just being a 6k isn't the worst in the world. 6 CP, sorry, isn't the worst in the world. But it's very easy to be able to get his cost down to at least 4 using things like Rydia and Ico. Odin, again, nice EX burst, can become cheap late game and can become even cheaper when you're running something like Unalaska. Atomos, generally good water summon, doesn't need any introduction. Being able to make it a 2-cost, fantastic. Being able to make it a 1-cost for Unalaska, even better. Finally, Ixion, just a nice board wipe with decent coverage. Now, unfortunately, it will hit a fair few of your own forwards in this deck. Alice, Kane, Rydia, Maki, Porum, and Ilua, so you need to be mindful of that. However, if you do hit your own Porum, at the very least, you get Ixion back, which isn't the worst. Or it doesn't have to be Ixion, it can be a different summon. But either way, you can play the Ixion, break all the 2 costs, and use Porum to then get, I don't know, something like a Tomos back to hand, or something which Ixion didn't hit, basically. And to be honest, that might be preferential, because you've got Ixion's ability, which is pay the additional 3 to then break all 3 costs and 2 costs. But if your opponent has got only 1 3 cost, and maybe you've got 1 as well, it might be better for Ixion to then break the Porum, to then use Porum to get back a different summon to then cast that summon, which probably will cost around 3 anyway, again, because Ixion will be 3, to get pay the 3 for that summon, at which point you can then break only your opponent's forward, rather than your opponent and your own forward. And then finally move on to the backups. So we have Yuna, again, needs no introduction, reduces the cost of your water summons. There aren't a huge amount of water summons in the deck, I appreciate that, there's only 4, but Man in Black means you get to keep on recasting them, which means that Una becomes even more effective. Sidiclan Gully, gone over this, searches Ilua, Maki the Phantasm, and Alice the Ensorcelled. Kalia Shivel, another backup searcher. Unfortunately, it doesn't search a water backup, but it does search you Quan, who is a very good card in my opinion. And it also gives Quan the 1 CP she needs to be able to use her ability as well. Arisha Al-Rashia. So, pay a Lightning Dull, discard 1 summon, search 1 summon, add it to your hand. And this kind of hits 2 birds with 1 stone. So you discard a summon, which is nice if you're using something like the Odin or Man in Black. But then also gets to search you any summon to hand, which is, again, really, really good. So you can use this during any combat, any, your opponent's phase, whatever. A lot of people forget about this card because it doesn't get much play, to be honest. So being able to just pay what is effectively 4 to go search any summon and then hopefully cast that, hopefully for cheap, it might be it finds you answers, right? And when you're in a sticky situation, using something like this will get you out of a tough spot, hopefully. Braska. So, Braska, I've tried building decks with this card before in the past, and rarely has it actually been effective, but this deck, it actually really works. So he reduces the cost of all your job summoners by 1. They can't become 0. So that means he'll reduce the cost of Una, Unaleska, Seymour, Alice the Ensorcelled, so she only becomes 1, and Rydia, and I think that's pretty decent. And given the fact that Rydia's searching cards as well, Unaleska's putting things into the break zone, Seymour's potentially breaking something, that's even better. So lots of more of the this cost efficiency in this deck as well. Oh, and Aiko as well, reduces the cost of Aiko as well, so she becomes a 1 cost backup, which is quite nice, and then she'll put someone into your break zone as well. Just being, I mean, you don't have to use Aiko's ability, and she does have recursion, which is nice, but yeah, to be able to pay the 1 for a backup, nice. Right, next we have Cecil. Already gone over this, just nice to be able to fund Rose's effect, can be recurred through the likes of Kane, but actually Cecil's ability is really strong in my opinion as well. So Dull puts Cecil into the break zone. During this turn, if a forward you control is dealt damage, reduce the damage by 2000 instead. So that's if any forward you control receives any damage throughout that turn. So it might be a case that your opponent's playing water and they haven't got Q-Chaspel down yet, and they are doing lots of chip damage. Every single instance of damage is reduced by 2, and it's to all your forwards, which pretty good, to be honest. Aiko. So yep, you put her in, or you can play her, search a summon, put it into the break zone. So again, nice to be able to fund Odin and Man in Black. But you can pay 1 water, 1 colorless, Dull, put Aiko into the break zone, choose on someone in your break zone, add it to your hand. That was this card has been really, really useful when my opponents managed to make a wide board, and I've been able to play something like Odin for quite cheap. So maybe I'm at 5 damage, but I've got Unaleska on the field, pay 1 for this Odin to break a forward, use Aiko to get it back to then play it again. Yeah, just being able to constantly keep on replaying the summons, maybe then attack with Man in Black. Oh no. Yeah, maybe attack with Man in Black to then get this Odin back again, to then cast it. You know, it's just being able to replay the same summon repeatedly, and Aiko is just another means of doing that. Assassin. There are very few ways in this deck to be able to deal damage to forwards, and there are many forwards in the game that cannot be broken by some of the abilities that don't deal damage. So Assassin is one of the few ways of being able to do that, and the chances of you getting to hand are actually pretty slim anyway. But Lightning Dull puts Assassin into break zone, choose 1 forward, enter the field this turn, deal 8k damage. Similar to the Remove summon from Opus 14? Can't remember now. Either way, yeah, but it's just another means of doing it. There's probably a case to be made about putting more damage dealing cards in this, but I like it the way it is. Chadley, really, really strong card. It shouldn't be understated that you can just keep on getting those things back to hand, which is really nice, especially when your opponent breaks something, they forget you've got Chadley, use Chadley at the end of their turn to just get that forward back, replay it. Nice. And what's more is that you can use Bismarck to bounce Chadley back to your hand to then replay him, so that when he does run out of counters, you can just restore them. And then finally Quan. Quan, just a really good card in my opinion. If, Seymour's the only forward you have on the field, play him onto the field, you break your opponent's forwards, use Quan to give Seymour haste, Dull, deal opponent damage, give Man in Black haste to then remove another summon and cast it, or maybe maybe be able to give Alice Ensorcelled haste if you also can activate her as well. Yeah, just all these ways of giving these really good forwards haste, and also just give them plus 2k as well, because 2k isn't a small power buff, so I think that's pretty worth it, to be honest. Just bear in mind that you can only use it when you only control one forward. And there we go. That is Zentet-Summon 1.2. It's, like I said, it's a bit clunky. If you come up against an aggro deck, you're gonna lose. You have means of aggressions for sure, but the chances of you actually being able to win back that damage war is pretty slim, because you will burn so many of your options trying to stop your opponent from aggressing you that by the time you've built back up, they've probably built back up as well. And there aren't a huge amount of force. I mean, there's 19, which is a fine amount. It's not tiny, but yeah, just want to bear in mind that if you come up against aggression, maybe don't buckle under the pressure. Rely on your EXs a little bit, which is a gamble, and just try to get those build back up, and then if you hit an EX which then stops you from dying, you can then use those backups to then play more forwards, which can then recur you summons, cast you summons, make summons removed from the game to cast them. You know, all these different means that actually start aggressing your opponent in other ways. But either way, it's a lot of fun to play when it does operate correctly. I mean, there's lots of, you can switch out loads of the summons for different things, put more water summons in so that unit's even more effective, maybe up the Rydia count, or, you know, get rid of things like Maki the Phantasm and Alice the Ensorcelled, because they don't do a huge amount, to be honest. They're just fun, nice to haves. Which at that point you can probably get rid of Sidaclan Gully. I mean, it's nice to have that with Ilua anyway, but then you could also get rid of the something like Kane, Rosa, and Cecil as well, and put them on something else, because Rosa's there mostly as a means of activating Alice Ensorcelled, but she also just has a really nice ability. So there is like a core component of this deck, which is things like Man and Black, Rydia, the Odins, and then using things like Braska and Aiko. But there are quite a few things that you could chop out and change. It could be said that maybe you just take out some of the water and put fire in there instead. Use Braska and start putting fire in it with it as well, which could be quite fun. But yeah, let me know what you guys think about the deck. What would you change? How would you make it maybe a bit more interesting? Anyway, thank you so much for watching, guys. Stay safe, be lucky, and I'll see you in the next video.